It's not a virus, it's something else. They knew what they were doing, but they didn't realize what they were playing with. We were invited. We signed contracts. We were so stupid.
The lock is locked. We've got you.
They don't want to just kill. They want to replace us.
The desert swallowed them whole. Dust churned beneath the convoy's wheels, a thick, choking fog that turned the landscape into a shifting wasteland of ochre and bone. The air was dry enough to crack lips, sting eyes, and scrape against throats like sandpaper. For hours, the trucks rumbled forward, their engines the only sound in a place where nothing lived. No birds, no insects, only the sun, the sky, and the endless stretch of nothing. Dr. Corwin Henshaw sat stiffly in the back of one of the transport vehicles, squeezed between strangers whose faces were as gaunt and uncertain as his own. No one spoke. Some had their arms crossed over their chests, heads bowed as if they were already regretting the decision that had led them here. Others simply stared ahead, eyes hollow, exhausted from the journey. There were at least a dozen other trucks in the convoy, all packed just as tightly. Hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, had been recruited for this so-called study, a human resilience experiment, they had been told. High pay, food, shelter, a clean slate for those who had nowhere else to go. But the deeper they drove into the desert, the more Corwin doubted the official explanation. He could see it in the soldiers seated at the edges of the truck beds. They weren't the kind of security hired to protect civilians. They were armed with real weapons, carrying themselves with the stiff, controlled tension of men who expected a fight. No one had been allowed to bring personal devices. There had been no paperwork, no contracts, just a curt, "You'll be compensated upon completion." It had been days since Corwin had last seen anything resembling civilization. The GPS in the transport had been disabled. Even if he wanted to, he had no way of knowing where they were. And then, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Base Omicron came into view. It rose from the desert floor like an obsidian monolith, its angular walls dark against the pale sky. There were no windows, only towering reinforced structures that stretched deep into the ground. A massive rectangular gate loomed at the entrance, sealed tight with hydraulic locks, thick enough to withstand an explosion. The facility had the distinct look of something that was never meant to be found. The convoy slowed, dust swirling in thick waves around the vehicles. The moment the engines cut off, the silence became unbearable. The gate split open with a hiss, steam venting from unseen mechanisms. Beyond it, the facility swallowed them in shadow. Corwin stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on gravel. The heat of the desert vanished the moment they crossed the threshold, replaced by a sterile, artificial chill. He cast a glance at the others. Some of them were staring up at the massive structure, unease plain in their expressions. Others, mostly the ones who had been promised a new life here, still clung to hope. The soldiers moved quickly, barking orders. Move forward, stand in line, no talking. They were herded into a wide, brightly lit chamber, something between a processing center and a medical facility. The walls were smooth, metallic, seamless. No signs, no windows. The air smelled like disinfectant, sharp and artificial. A voice crackled over unseen speakers. "Welcome to Base Omicron. You will be assigned to your designated quarters shortly. You will receive your schedule for work duties within the next 24 hours. Follow all facility protocols, and you will be compensated accordingly. Any violations will result in immediate termination." There was no warmth in the words, no introduction. Just a clinical, almost robotic statement of fact. People shuffled forward in silence as a row of masked personnel in lab coats began administering health checks. Corwin watched as each person was scanned with a handheld device, their vitals measured, their blood drawn. The workers moved with cold efficiency, jotting down notes on black tablets before dismissing each individual with a nod. His turn came quickly. A woman in a sterile suit pressed a scanner against his neck. It beeped once, a faint prick at his arm. Blood test. No explanation, no reaction to his questioning look. She simply motioned for him to move forward. Beyond the medical station, soldiers directed them toward the lower levels. The facility was bigger than it seemed. Most of it was underground. As they descended, the temperature dropped further. Cold metal walls, flickering LED panels, corridors that stretched too far, too empty. His assigned quarters were barely more than a cell, a bunk, a locker, a single dim light overhead. No windows. The walls were too smooth, too seamless, like a place designed to keep people in, not out. Corwin sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. Something wasn't right. He could feel it like an itch at the base of his skull. The silence in the facility was wrong, too controlled, too absolute. That night, as he lay staring at the ceiling, he heard it for the first time. A sound rising through the air vents, distant, muffled, wet. It wasn't the hum of machinery. It wasn't the wind. It was screaming. The screams didn't stop. They came in waves, distant yet unmistakable, filtering through the air vents like the faint echoes of something tearing itself apart. At first, Corwin thought he was imagining it. Sleep deprivation, stress, paranoia. He had spent years working in high-security laboratories, and he knew how isolation played tricks on the mind. But when he stepped into the corridor the next morning, the other recruits had the same look in their eyes. They had heard it too. No one spoke of it. The fear was silent, unspoken, but it clung to the air like the sterile scent of the facility itself. Routine settled in. Days passed in a pattern of monotony. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Their assigned tasks varied. Some were assigned to maintenance, others to food processing, others to medical observation. Corwin, along with a handful of other scientists, was escorted to Laboratory Sector C, a subterranean wing of Base Omicron, where the walls were colder, the air sharper, the lighting dimmer. He was there to observe. That was what they told him. At first, the research seemed simple: viral resilience studies, controlled pathogen exposure, immune response trials. Standard high-security testing, the kind Corwin had conducted before. But there was something different here. Something wrong. The test subjects were not volunteers. They were the people who had arrived with him, the ones who had been pulled aside during medical screening. Their vitals had been recorded, their conditions noted, their names erased. They had been given numbered wristbands instead, strapped to hospital beds behind thick observation glass. Corwin stood before the glass one evening, watching as a woman, no, 137, began to convulse. She had been healthy when she arrived. Now her veins were bulging, darkening, pressing against her skin like swollen cords. Her pupils had dilated into black voids. Sweat slicked her skin as she trembled against her restraints, jaw locked in a silent scream. Something was moving beneath her flesh. Corwin's hands curled into fists. He turned to the lead researcher, Dr. Fletcher, a stiff-backed man with the demeanor of a mortician. "What did you expose her to?" Corwin asked. Dr. Fletcher didn't look up from his tablet. "A biological sample." Corwin's stomach twisted. "That's not an answer." Fletcher finally met his gaze. "You were brought here to observe, Doctor. Henshaw, not to question." Through the glass, the woman's breathing hitched. Her fingers twitched, curling like talons. The veins along her arms shifted, as though something was burrowing through them, moving beneath her skin like a network of writhing filaments. She began to change. The flesh around her mouth cracked, lips splitting as something pressed against the inside of her cheeks, as if her teeth were being reshaped. Her shoulders twisted, bones grinding against each other, elongating unnaturally beneath the skin. Her breathing turned ragged, shallow, and then, without warning, she lurched forward, spine arching as a wet, cracking sound filled the observation chamber. Her jaw split open, unhinging with an audible snap, her flesh peeling back to reveal something beneath. Something not human. Corwin staggered back. Dr. Fletcher remained impassive. "The organism is adapting," he said. Corwin's mouth went dry. He turned back to the woman, to what used to be a woman. As her skin sloughed away in patches, her body reshaping itself into something that no longer followed the laws of biology. Tendons snapped, stretched. Her hands fused together, fingers merging into slick, elongated appendages tipped with jagged ridges. A new mouth formed beneath her first one, filled with rows of moving teeth, flexing and twitching like living needles. She was still alive, still conscious. The thing that had once been a woman turned its head toward the glass, its too wide mouth curling. It was smiling. Corwin's stomach twisted. He stepped away from the window, his pulse hammering against his ribs. "What is this?" His voice came out hoarse. Dr. Fletcher only tapped at his tablet, scrolling through unreadable data. "It's progress," he said. Corwin wanted to vomit. They weren't testing a virus. They were breeding something. That night, the screams in the facility grew louder. The facility was failing. Corwin knew it the moment the alarms began to blare, the red warning lights casting flickering shadows down the corridors. The air was wrong, thicker, heavier, carrying a scent that no human body should ever produce. Something like rot, but fresher. Alive. People were running. Some were screaming. Others were silent, their eyes wide with the paralyzing realization that there was nowhere to go. The security measures had collapsed, not all at once, but in pieces, failing in a slow, inevitable sequence, like dominoes tipping toward disaster. Containment had been breached. The infected were loose. Corwin pressed himself against the cold metal of the corridor wall, his breath shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. Blood was smeared across the floor, thick and black, almost oily in the dim red light. It wasn't from gunfire. Something else had torn these people apart. He moved quickly, staying low. The plan had come together in whispers over the past few days. He wasn't the only one who had seen the truth, who had realized that this was not an experiment meant to be controlled. This was a breeding ground, a test to see how long it would take before the infection could no longer be contained. The government wasn't trying to stop it. They were watching it evolve. Corwin reached the rendezvous point, a storage sector near the facility's east wing. There were 5 others waiting. Elena, a combat medic with too many scars to be a new recruit. Reyes, an ex-soldier who had noticed the extra bodies disappearing at night. Osman, an engineer who had access to the facility's power grid, and 2 technicians whose names Corwin didn't even know. Their eyes all held the same exhaustion, the same realization that they had made a mistake by coming here. Osman was already working on the security panel, his hands shaking as he rewired the access code to open the emergency maintenance tunnels. "They sealed the outer gates," he muttered, voice barely audible over the distant wet sounds of something moving through the vents. "We have to go underground. It's the only way to get past the lockdown." Elena swore under her breath. "They'll be waiting down there." "We don't have a choice." A crash echoed from deeper inside the facility, louder this time, closer. Corwin didn't look. He already knew what was coming. He had seen it happen in the labs, people twisting into something else, their bodies betraying them, reshaping them into forms that no longer made sense. Something skittered in the distance. Too many limbs. Too fast. Reyes grabbed Corwin by the shoulder. "Move!" They slipped into the tunnel system, Osman sealing the hatch behind them. The maintenance tunnels were narrow, carved deep into the earth beneath base Omicron, winding like veins through the facility's foundation. The air was damp, warm, breathing. Elena took point, her rifle raised. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." They ran. The tunnels weren't empty. The first one they saw had once been a man. Now he was a structure, his body fused to the walls, his torso split open like a blossoming flower, veins stretching out like roots. His mouth moved, whispering in a voice that was no longer human. "It's awake." Elena shot him. He didn't die. His ribs twitched, his eyes rolling back, and something peeled itself from his chest. A shape that dripped like melted cartilage, shrieking as it launched forward. Reyes fired. The thing convulsed, but it didn't stop. It moved too fast, a slick blur of tendons and shifting bones, latching onto one of the technicians. A scream, a crunch, and then silence. They didn't stop running. The tunnels opened into a service bay, a massive underground chamber filled with abandoned vehicles and supply crates. A blast door led to the surface exit, where the emergency power grid could override the lockdown. Osman sprinted for the control panel. "Cover me!" Reyes and Elena took defensive positions, their weapons aimed at the tunnel they had come from. The air was shaking, reverberating with something deep, guttural, ancient. It wasn't just one of them. The infected were everywhere. Osman's hands flew over the controls. Almost there. The lights flickered, and then they came. From the tunnels, from the vents, from the ceiling. They were wrong. Bodies half-formed, bones bending the wrong way, mouths filled with teeth that weren't teeth anymore. Some still wore remnants of their uniforms, their ID badges hanging limply from exposed rib cages, their faces stretching into something inhuman. Elena opened fire. Reyes screamed as something latched onto his leg, pulling him down, his knee buckling, twisting. Corwin ran. There was no stopping this, no fighting it, only escape. Osman hit the override. The blast door screeched open, the desert wind rushing in. The sky above was ink black, the first traces of dawn on the horizon. Elena turned to follow, but something wrapped around her throat. Her gun clattered to the ground. Her eyes met Corwin's. She didn't scream. She only mouthed one word. "Run." Corwin did. Osman was ahead of him, sprinting toward the dunes beyond the facility. The air was thick with the scent of blood, of something no longer human. And when Corwin turned back, he saw them, spilling from the entrance, crawling, shifting, stretching into the open desert. The government hadn't just unleashed a weapon, they had woken something up, and now there was nothing left to contain it. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a barren graveyard of cracked earth and jagged rock. The sky above was beginning to change, a murky, unnatural red bleeding into the horizon, as if something had begun seeping into the atmosphere itself. Corwin's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he stumbled forward. He didn't know how long he had been running. Behind him, base Omicron was dead, or rather, it was dying, collapsing into itself as something inside it continued to spread, to consume. He could still hear the distant echoes of gunfire, but it was intermittent now, weak. The last remnants of the facility's security forces fighting a battle they had already lost. Osman had made it out with him, but the moment they had reached open ground, he had slowed. His breath had turned shallow, his skin had begun to shiver, his pupils darkening. Corwin had seen the movement beneath his skin. Osman had known, too. "Don't stop," he had said, before pulling the trigger against his own skull. Corwin had barely registered the sound. He had simply kept running. The emergency uplink station was still miles away, hidden beyond the dunes, buried in a reinforced outpost meant for last resort communications. If he could reach it, if he could send a warning, maybe the outside world would listen. Maybe they would see what was coming before it was too late. But the infection was already in him. He could feel it writhing beneath his skin like a second pulse. His veins had darkened, his fingers trembled, not from exhaustion but from something deeper, something inside him, threading itself through his muscles, his bones, reshaping him in ways he didn't want to understand. He had seen what happened to the others. He had watched them change. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't a weapon. It was something older, something living, something that had been buried beneath this desert for centuries, waiting for a way back into the world. And now it had found one. The ground beneath his feet rumbled. Not an earthquake, not a storm, something breathing. Corwin reached the base of a rocky ridge, dragging himself upward, his fingers slipping against the sharp stone. His nails were peeling away. His skin felt loose, as if it wasn't entirely his anymore. He bit down a scream, forcing himself forward, refusing to look at his hands. He reached the crest of the ridge and froze. The desert below was moving. The sand rippled like water, waves shifting beneath the surface, something massive stirring beneath the earth. Blackened tendrils, slick and fibrous, began to uncoil, emerging from beneath the facility's ruins, stretching toward the sky like the roots of something that should have never been unearthed. The infection had never been contained to human bodies. The entire facility had been its host. It was awake now, and it was growing. Corwin's knees buckled, his vision swam, darkness creeping into the edges. His pulse no longer belonged to him. He could feel something else beating beneath his ribs, something that had begun to whisper to him, telling him to stop running, to let it in, to let it finish. He fought it. He had to keep moving. The uplink station was less than a mile away now, its antenna barely visible against the sky. The last outpost. The last chance. He stumbled forward, his body protesting, his limbs heavy as if they were no longer entirely his own. The air had changed. It smelled like blood, like decay, like something that had been waiting for a very long time to return. Corwin reached the outpost. His vision blurred. He entered the control room, fingers barely obeying him as he activated the broadcast. The emergency frequency flickered to life, its signal fighting against the interference of the thing rising behind him. His hands weren't his hands anymore. His skin had begun to split. He could feel it inside him now, pushing against the walls of his flesh, trying to get out, to reshape him into something new, something better, something belonging to it. But he wasn't done. He pressed the button. A warning, a plea, a message sent into the world before the world had a chance to be swallowed whole. He turned back toward the desert, toward the sky that was no longer just a sky, toward the thing that was rising from the earth, its form twisting, expanding, a shape that no human mind was meant to understand. It was too late for him. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for everyone else. Corwin let out a breath. His lips curled into something that might have once been a smile, but now felt wrong, stretched too wide. His skin rippled, his mouth split open, and the thing inside him finally answered back.